living in the middle of nowhere. Until a millionaire hiding from the police cried for help, Walter Thompson had lived for 15 years in a wooden cabin tucked away in the Adirondack Mountains, far from any neighbors, surviving only on what he grew and raised. His simple routine had been broken only by the sounds of nature, until that rainy March afternoon when he heard hurried footsteps approaching. That was when he saw a man in a dark suit, completely drenched and with a face marked by desperation, pounding forcefully on his door. The stranger kept looking over his shoulder, as if fleeing something terrible. "Please, sir, let me in," the man shouted, his refined accent contrasting with the panic in his voice. "I need to hide." Walter hesitated for a moment. At 62, he had learned to distrust strangers, especially those who showed up at his isolated property in upstate New York. But there was something in the man's expression that struck a chord in his heart. "Who are you? What's going on?" Walter asked, keeping the door slightly ajar. "My name is Richard Harrison. I'm a businessman, or was. The police are after me for something I didn't do. Please, just one night. I'll pay whatever it takes." The mention of the police made Walter take a step back. He had chosen this isolated life precisely to avoid trouble, and now it was literally knocking on his door. But the rain was getting heavier and this man was clearly in distress. "Come in," he finally said, opening the door, "but I don't want any trouble in my home." Richard stumbled inside, leaving a trail of water on the wooden floor of the small living room. His expensive clothes were caked in mud, and Walter noticed the man carried only a small leather backpack. Thank you so much," Richard said, trembling. "I have no idea what this means to me. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. Walter brought out an old towel and a blanket, watching his unexpected guest with curiosity mixed with concern. Richard looked to be in his 40s, with neatly trimmed brown hair, but the fear in his eyes was real and deep. "Is the police really after you?" Walter asked, pouring hot coffee. "They are, but I swear on my mother's memory I didn't do anything wrong. It's all a terrible misunderstanding. My own wife reported me to the authorities, claiming I was embezzling money from the company." "Were you?" Richard looked Walter straight in the eye. "No, I would never do that. I built my company from scratch, working 18-hour days for 20 years. Why would I destroy it all now?" There was a sincerity in his voice that made Walter believe him, at least partly, but many questions remained. "How did you get here? This area is pretty remote." "I left my car on a back road and walked. I came this way because—" Richard hesitated. "Because my grandfather used to bring me fishing in a river near here when I was a boy. It's the only good memory I have of this place." Walter nodded, starting to understand the situation better. This wasn't just any fugitive, but a desperate man seeking refuge in memories of simpler times. "You can stay tonight," Walter said, "but tomorrow morning, you need to tell me the whole truth." Richard agreed, visibly relieved. Walter made up a spot for him to sleep on the small living room couch, and during the night he heard muffled sobs coming from the room. It stirred something unexpected in him. The next morning, Richard woke to the sound of Walter making coffee and fresh eggs. The familiar scent of home-cooked food brought tears to his eyes, reminding him of his grandmother's kitchen. "Did you sleep well?" asked Walter, serving breakfast. "Better than the last 2 weeks," admitted Richard. "I couldn't rest at home, always expecting someone to knock on the door." Walter sat at the simple wooden table, studying his guest's face. In the daylight, he could see Richard was thinner than he should be, with deep dark circles under his eyes and hands that trembled slightly. "Tell me the whole story," said Walter. "From the beginning." Richard took a deep breath and began. He spoke of how he'd built his tech company from a small rented office in Boston, how he met his wife, Catherine, at a graduation party and married her, believing he'd found true love. "Over the last 2 years, Catherine started to change," said Richard, stirring his coffee. "She became more interested in money than in our relationship. She questioned every decision I made for the company, demanding access to all the accounts. And you gave it to her." "No, the company was my life, my child. I couldn't just hand over control like that. It led to constant fights at home." Richard explained how 3 weeks earlier, he'd discovered Catherine was having an affair with Michael Peterson, his minority partner in the company. Worse, the two had plotted to remove him from leadership. They went to the police claiming I was funneling money into offshore accounts. They presented fake documents, very well-made ones. When investigators came for me, I realized I couldn't prove my innocence quickly. Then why run? If you're innocent, you should have stayed to defend yourself. Richard lowered his head in shame. Because I'm a coward. I spent my whole life building a reputation, and suddenly, I watched it all crumble. I thought if I stepped away for a while, I could gather proof of Catherine and Michael's betrayal. Walter saw the genuine pain on Richard's face and began to feel compassion for this man who'd lost everything he thought mattered. There was something familiar about this story of betrayal and escape. What about your family? Do you have children? No. Catherine always said she wanted to wait for the right time. Now I realize she never wanted children with me. She just wanted access to my money. The two men sat in silence for a few minutes, each lost in thought. Walter saw reflections of his own past in Richard's situation, though he wasn't ready to share his secrets. "You can stay a few more days," he said finally, "but you'll have to help with chores. I don't keep idle people here." Richard agreed immediately, grateful for the unexpected hospitality. Over the following days, Walter watched with amusement as Richard made clumsy attempts at farm work. The millionaire businessman didn't even know how to feed the chickens properly, scattering feed all over the coop. When he tried milking Walter's only cow, the animal refused to cooperate, as if sensing his inexperience. "Never done manual labor in your life?" asked Walter, hiding a smile. "My first job was at a tech company when I was 22. Before that, I only studied. My parents always said manual work was for those who hadn't gone to school." "Your parents were wrong," said Walter, showing him how to plant seeds in the garden. "Working with your hands teaches things no college can." Richard began to understand that in the days that followed. There was something deeply satisfying about watching plants grow, tending to animals, or fixing a broken fence. For the first time in years, he slept soundly and woke up rested. A week after his arrival, as they worked together repairing the cabin roof damaged by the last heavy rain, Richard made an unexpected confession. "You know, Walter, sometimes I think this was the best thing that's happened to me in years." "How so?" "Finding out who Catherine really was before having children with her, realizing my life was empty even with all that money. Here, doing these simple tasks, I feel more useful than I have in a long time." Walter stopped hammering and looked at Richard. "Money doesn't buy happiness, but the lack of it can bring a lot of suffering. The secret is finding balance." "How did you come to that conclusion?" Richard asked. Walter hesitated. He'd kept his story to himself for so long that speaking about it seemed impossible. But there was something about Richard that made him feel safe. "Because I had money once too, and I lost everything because of my pride and stubbornness." "Really? You were a businessman?" "I owned a small furniture factory in Syracuse. Nothing compared to what you had, but by the town's standards, I was successful. Had a big house, 2 cars, employees who depended on me." "What happened?" Walter climbed down from the ladder where he'd been working and sat on a log, clearly preparing for a long conversation. "I fell in love with a married woman. Rachel was my accountant's wife, but we started an affair. I thought she'd leave her husband for me, that we'd build a life together." Richard sat beside him, intrigued by the story. "Rachel convinced me to make some risky investments, saying she had insider information through her husband. I put nearly everything I had into a company she swore would take off. And it didn't? It was all a lie. Rachel and her husband were working together to scam me. They knew the company was going under, and I ended up losing not just my money but also what I'd borrowed from friends and family." "Wow, that's awful." "The worst was yet to come. When I discovered the betrayal and confronted Rachel, she claimed I'd threatened her. Her husband had connections in town, and suddenly I was the villain. I lost the factory, the house, my friends, even my family turned their backs on me." Richard shook his head, understanding the pain Walter had endured. "Is that why you came here?" "I arrived 15 years ago with nothing but the clothes on my back and a little money I'd hidden. Bought this cheap piece of land because no one else wanted it, and I've lived like this ever since. isolated from everything and everyone. Did you ever think about going back, trying to rebuild your life in the city? Walter looked at the mountains around them, where the setting sun painted the sky orange. At first, I planned to stay just long enough to gather the strength to start over, but over time I realized I had peace here. No betrayals, no lies, no fakeness, just me and nature. But don't you miss people? Companionship? I did, especially in the early years. But solitude teaches you a lot about yourself. I learned to be content, to find satisfaction in simple things. Richard was quiet for a few minutes. Do you think I should do the same? Just disappear and start a new life somewhere? I can't answer that for you, Walter said, but I can say running from problems isn't always the solution. Sometimes you have to face them head on. But how? I have no proof of Catherine's betrayal. No way to prove I'm innocent. If I go back, I'll be arrested. Maybe. But at least your conscience will be clear. And who knows, with time, the truth might come out. That night, Richard couldn't sleep, thinking about Walter's words. There was a wisdom in this simple man he'd never found in all the expensive consultants and therapists he'd ever seen. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. The next morning, as they tended to the garden, Richard asked a question that had been on his mind all night. Walter, have you ever regretted coming here? Choosing isolation. Walter stopped watering the plants and looked up at the morning blue sky. Some days yes, some days no, but lately I've been thinking it might be time to give the outside world another chance. Because of my arrival. Partly, you reminded me that not everyone is like Rachel, that there are still good people in the world. Richard was moved by those words. In his life as a businessman, he was used to cold, calculated dealings. Walter's simplicity and honesty were refreshing. I have a proposal for you, Richard said impulsively. What proposal? Once I sort out my problems, I'd like you to be my partner in something new, not a big, complex company, but something simple, honest. Maybe something related to organic farming or rural tourism. Walter smiled for the first time since Richard had arrived. Let's solve your problems first, then we'll think about the future. Just then they heard the sound of an engine approaching. The two men exchanged glances, and Richard turned pale. Did they find me? Let's see, Walter said, walking toward the property's entrance. An old pickup truck stopped in front of the cabin, and out stepped a woman around 50, her grey hair tied in a simple bun. Walter immediately recognized her as Mrs. Mitchell, his closest neighbor, who lived about 3 miles away. Good morning, Walter, Mrs. Mitchell greeted him, carrying a bag. I brought some sweets I made yesterday. Good morning, Mrs. Mitchell. Thank you so much. You're always so kind. Mrs. Mitchell noticed Richard, who had half hidden behind Walter, and her face showed curiosity. I didn't know you had visitors, she said, trying to mask her interest. Ah, this is my nephew, Richard. He's spending a few days here with me. Richard waved timidly, silently thanking Walter for not revealing his true situation. How lovely, Mrs. Mitchell said, visibly pleased. You were always so alone here. I've always told my husband that Walter needed company. After Mrs. Mitchell left, Richard questioned Walter about his decision to protect him. Why did you lie to her? Because I saw in your eyes that you're telling the truth about your innocence, and because everyone deserves a second chance. In the following days, their routine changed significantly. Richard was adapting better to farm work, and Walter was rediscovering the joy of human companionship. They talked for hours about their lives, dreams, and regrets. One afternoon, while fishing in the small river that ran through Walter's property, Richard made a revelation that changed everything. Walter, I need to tell you something. I didn't share the whole truth about how I got here. Walter's stomach tightened. What do you mean? I didn't walk from the road. Actually, my private driver brought me close by. He's waiting at an inn about 12 miles away, ready to pick me up when I call. Why lie? Because I was afraid you wouldn't let me stay if you knew I still had contact with the outside world. I wanted you to see me as someone truly desperate. Walter was silent for a few minutes, processing this. He felt a little betrayed. but also understood Richard's reasons. "Any other lies you need to tell me?" "No, I promise everything else is true. The story about the company, Catherine, the escape, all of it's real." "And why are you telling me this now?" Richard looked at the fishing rod in his hands, noticing how different they looked, more calloused, stronger. "Because these days here have made me realize I need to be honest with myself and the people around me. You've been more of a friend to me than many people I've known for years." Walter nodded, understanding Richard's inner struggle. "I appreciate your honesty, but does this mean you could leave at any moment?" "I could, but I don't want to. At least not yet. I'm still not ready to face the world out there." That night, the two men had the deepest conversation since they'd met. Richard confessed he had thought about never returning to his old life, about simply disappearing the way Walter had done. "But you were right," Richard said. "Running away doesn't solve problems, it just delays them." "And what's your plan then?" "I don't know yet, but I know that when I leave here I want to be a better person than I was when I arrived." Walter smiled, proud of the transformation he saw in Richard. "You already are a better person. You just needed to realize it." 2 weeks later, while working together to build a new chicken coop, they heard the sound of approaching vehicles again. This time it was 2 pickup trucks, and Richard immediately tensed up. "Relax," Walter said. "If it were the police, they wouldn't come in old pickups." From the trucks stepped 4 men whom Walter recognized as local farm workers. The group's leader, a tall, dark-haired man named John Carter, greeted Walter. "Good morning, Walter. We came to talk to you about something important." "What's happened, John?" "It's about the land at the old Pleasant Valley farm. The owner passed away, and the heirs want to sell everything to a mining company. If that happens, they'll ruin the river that supplies our properties." Walter grew concerned. Pleasant Valley Farm was at the headwaters of the river that ran through his land and several other small farms in the area. "What can we do to stop it?" "We need to organize and maybe try to buy the land collectively, but for that we'd need someone who understands business and legal paperwork, someone educated." John Carter glanced at Richard, who had stayed quiet throughout the conversation. "You're not really Walter's nephew, are you? The way you talk and dress, you seem like an educated man." Richard looked at Walter, who nodded encouragingly. "Actually, I'm a businessman. I do understand business and legal matters. So could you help us?" Richard hesitated for a moment. Helping these people would mean exposing himself, dealing with notaries, banks, maybe even appearing in public records. But looking at the hopeful faces of the farm workers, he couldn't refuse. "Yes, I can. Let's look into the situation and see what we can do." In the following days, Richard threw himself into the Pleasant Valley Farm issue. He called his driver and asked him to bring some documents and his laptop. For the first time in weeks, he put his business skills to use again. Walter watched in fascination as Richard transformed in his element. His uncertainty gave way to confidence, and he displayed an impressive ability to analyze contracts and find creative solutions. "I've discovered some interesting things," Richard said after 3 days of research. "The mining company hasn't made a formal offer yet. They're just testing the waters. And there's an environmental law we can use to block mining in this area." "How so?" "The area is part of a watershed protection zone. If we can prove that mining would harm the water supply for multiple families, we could get a court injunction to stop the sale." John Carter and the other workers were excited about the possibility, but also worried about the costs of a lawsuit. "Don't worry about the expenses," said Richard. "I'll cover everything. I see it as an investment in this region's future." It was at that moment Walter realized Richard had found a purpose greater than his personal troubles. Seeing him help those humble families stirred a genuine admiration in him. 2 weeks later, when the injunction was granted and the sale to the mining company was blocked, the entire rural community in the area gathered at Walter's property for a celebration of gratitude. Richard was radiant, feeling useful in a way he'd never experienced in his past business ventures, but the joy was interrupted when Mrs. Mitchell brought troubling news. "Richard, there are some men in suits asking for you in town. They said they're lawyers and have an important proposal for you." Richard's stomach dropped. He knew those men were likely connected to his legal troubles in Boston. "What should I do?" he asked Walter, visibly nervous. "Face it, You've spent the last few weeks helping others, proving to yourself you're a good person. Now it's time to resolve your own problems. Richard knew Walter was right, but fear still clouded his thoughts. What if they arrest me? If you're as innocent as you say, the truth will come out. And if it doesn't, at least you'll sleep with a clear conscience. That night, Richard called his driver and arranged a meeting with the lawyers. It would take place the next day at an inn in the nearest town. The following morning, Richard dressed in one of the outfits he'd asked his driver to bring, a navy blue suit that made him look like the successful businessman he once was. But inside, he felt completely different. Whatever the outcome, I want you to know these days here have changed my life, he told Walter before leaving. And you've changed mine too, Walter replied. You reminded me there's still kindness in the world. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers a lot. Now, continuing. The meeting with the lawyers brought surprising revelations. They weren't representing the prosecution, but rather Catherine, who wanted to settle with Richard. Dr. Harrison, your wife is willing to drop all charges in exchange for 30% of the company's shares, said the lead lawyer, a bald man in his 50s. 30%? Richard was outraged. She's entitled to nothing. She's the one who betrayed me, who forged documents against me. But you can't prove that, can you? Meanwhile, the company loses value every day without your leadership. Richard felt the old anger rising, but then he remembered his talks with Walter, the peace he'd found in the Adirondacks, the humble people he'd helped. Tell Catherine I accept the offer, he said, surprising the lawyers. You accept? Just like that, no negotiation? I do. 30% of the shares for my freedom and an end to this nightmare. But I want her to sign a document admitting the accusations were false. The lawyers exchanged glances, clearly not expecting such a quick response. We'll consult our client and get back to you within 24 hours. Richard returned to Walter's property with mixed feelings. On one hand, he felt relieved to finally see light at the end of the tunnel. On the other, it pained him to know Catherine would profit from her betrayal. How did it go? Walter asked as soon as Richard stepped out of the truck. They want to settle. Catherine wants 30% of the company in exchange for dropping the charges. And you're going to accept? I already did. Walter was surprised by the response. That's not what I expected from you. Why? Because the Richard who showed up here a month ago would have fought for every last penny. He'd have risked jail just to keep Catherine from winning. Richard smiled, understanding what Walter meant. You're right, I've changed. I realized 70% of something I love is better than 100% of something that leaves me bitter. And what will you do with the company? I'll go back, but it won't be the same. I want to make changes, focus on projects that truly help people, like creating technology for small rural producers, systems that can help communities like this one. Walter nodded, proud of Richard's transformation. And me? I'll miss our talks. Who says they have to end? Richard grinned. I want you to be my special consultant for rural projects, with a fixed salary and everything. I don't need a salary, Richard. It's not about need, it's about deserving it. You've taught me more about business and life in these weeks than all the expensive consultants I've ever hired. The next day, the lawyers returned with confirmation that Catherine had accepted the terms of the agreement. Richard would sign the papers the following week in Boston, officially ending his time as a fugitive. But before leaving the Adirondacks for good, he wanted to do something special for the community that had indirectly welcomed him through his project to save Pleasant Valley Farm. I have a proposal for you, he said to John Carter and the other farm workers during a meeting at Walter's house. I want to help you buy Pleasant Valley Farm collectively and turn it into an organic farming cooperative. But that must cost a fortune, John said. I'll finance the purchase, and you can pay me back over 10 years, interest-free. Just promise me one thing, that you'll care for the land as it deserves. The proposal moved everyone. It was a chance not only to preserve the river, but also to improve the lives of many families in the area. 2 weeks later, Richard returned to Boston to sign the agreements. Walter went with him, leaving the mountains for the first time in 15 years. The city had changed since Walter had left, but the old feelings of anxiety and claustrophobia returned instantly. He began to question whether he'd made the right choice in following Richard. The meeting with Catherine was tense. She arrived with Michael and 2 lawyers, clearly expecting a defeated version of Richard. She looked visibly surprised to see him tanned, physically stronger, and radiating a confidence she didn't recognize. "You look different," Catherine said, unable to hide her curiosity. "People change, Catherine, sometimes for the better." "I hope you won't make things difficult for us at the company," Michael said, trying to sound threatening. Richard looked at him with a calm expression that unsettled his former partner. "I won't make anything difficult. In fact, I'm thinking of stepping back from the company's day-to-day operations." "What do you mean?" Catherine couldn't hide her surprise. "I want to focus on new projects, things that actually make a difference in people's lives. The company can continue as is. You'll have far less interference from me." Catherine and Michael exchanged glances, clearly baffled by Richard's new attitude. They'd expected a broken man desperate to keep control of his company at all costs. The documents were signed without further issues, and Richard officially regained his legal freedom. But what moved him most was seeing Walter watching the whole process with genuine interest. "How do you feel?" Walter asked as they left the lawyer's office. "Free, truly free, for the first time in years." That night, staying at a hotel in downtown Boston, the 2 men talked about the future. "Are you going back to the Adirondacks?" Richard asked. "I haven't decided yet. The city makes me anxious, but I also realize I isolated myself too much all these years. Maybe it's time to find a middle ground." "I have an idea. How about splitting your time between the mountains and the city? You could have a small place here and spend a few weeks a month helping me with new projects." Walter considered the offer. The idea of contributing to something bigger than his own survival was appealing, but he still had doubts about reintegrating into society. "I don't know if people would accept me after so many years alone. I've lost my touch with people." "Walter, in the last 2 months, you've helped me become a better person, helped an entire community save their land, and even stepped out of your isolation. If that's not knowing how to handle people, I don't know what is." The following week, Richard implemented significant changes at the company. He created a special division focused on family farming technologies, with Walter as the lead consultant. The first initiative would be developing smart irrigation systems for small farmers. Walter, in turn, decided to keep his property in the mountains as his base, but started spending 2 weeks a month in Boston working on Richard's new projects. The change was good for both of them. Richard rediscovered his passion for his work, seeing how his technologies could truly impact ordinary lives. Walter gradually regained confidence in social interactions, realizing his life experience was valued by many. 6 months after their first meeting, both their lives had completely changed. Richard had officially ended his marriage with Catherine, who found running a tech company wasn't as easy as she'd imagined. The business thrived under Richard's new philosophy, focused on social impact projects. Walter had become a respected figure in sustainable agriculture, consulted by various companies and organizations. But the most significant transformation happened during the opening of the cooperative at the old Pleasant Valley farm. Seeing all those families celebrating not just the land acquisition, but also the new irrigation systems that had been installed, Richard felt a satisfaction he'd never known in his previous ventures. "Thank you," he said to Walter during the celebration. "For what?" "For showing me there's a different way to live. For teaching me that success isn't just measured in money." Walter smiled, watching the children playing by the river they'd managed to preserve. "And thank you for showing me it's never too late to start over." A year later, during one of Richard's visits to the mountains, Walter shared unexpected news. "I got a letter from Rachel," he said, holding an opened envelope. "Your ex-girlfriend. After 15 years, she found out where I live through a mutual acquaintance. She wants to meet, says she has something important to tell me." Richard was concerned about the emotional impact this might have on Walter. "Are you going to see her?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to close that chapter for good, but another part is curious about what she has to say. If you decide to meet, I'll go with you. You don't have to, Richard. I can handle it alone." "I know you can, but friends don't let friends face the past by themselves." 2 weeks later, Walter arranged to meet Rachel at a quiet cafe in Syracuse. Richard went with him, staying at a distant table for privacy, but ready to step in if needed. Rachel arrived on time, and Walter was surprised to see how much she'd aged. At 55, he looked at least 10 years older, with completely grey hair and deep wrinkles around his eyes. "Walter, thank you for agreeing to see me," she said, visibly nervous. "What do you want, Rachel?" "I want to apologize and tell you the truth about what happened 15 years ago." Walter felt his stomach tighten. He wasn't sure he wanted to hear that truth after so much time. "My husband forced me to do it," Rachel continued. "He found out about our affair and said he'd leave me in misery if I didn't help him swindle you. And you agreed. I was a coward, Walter, and I truly loved you, but I was afraid to leave the financial security my marriage gave me. Why are you telling me this now?" Rachel lowered her head, showing genuine shame. "Because my husband died 2 years ago, and on his deathbed, he confessed to many terrible things he'd done, including how he blackmailed you through me." Walter stayed silent, processing the information. All those years, he had carried not only the pain of betrayal, but also the guilt for being so naive. "He left behind some documents that prove your innocence in those investments. You really were the victim of an elaborate scam." Rachel handed him a folder with documents, which Walter quickly skimmed. They were written confessions, copies of forged papers, clear evidence he'd been manipulated. "What do you want in return for this?" Walter asked, suspicious. "Nothing. I just wanted you to know the truth, and for you to forgive me if possible." Walter looked at the woman he had once loved deeply, the one who had caused the destruction of his former life. He felt a mix of anger, sadness, and surprisingly, compassion. "I forgive you, Rachel, but I can't forget what happened." "I don't expect you to forget. I just wanted you to know our love was real, at least on my part." After Rachel left, Walter sat in the cafe for over an hour, staring at the documents that could have changed his life 15 years earlier. Richard approached quietly. "How are you holding up?" "Confused, relieved, sad, a lot of emotions at once." "What will you do with those documents?" Walter looked at the proof of his innocence, thinking of all the people who had doubted him, all the friends he'd lost, the life he'd left behind. "Nothing," he finally said. "What do you mean, nothing?" 15 years have passed, Richard. People have moved on, I've moved on. I won't dig up the past just to prove I was right. But you could restore your reputation, maybe even sue his family for damages." Walter shook his head, a serene smile on his lips. "The reputation I have now is far more valuable than anything I had before. And as for lawsuits, I don't want to live in the past anymore." Richard admired his friend's wisdom and maturity once again. That decision showed just how much Walter had grown during his years of isolation. "So what do we do now?" "We head back to the mountains. I have a new tomato variety I want to test in the garden." On the drive back, Walter stayed quiet, reflecting on life's unexpected turns. If he hadn't been betrayed, he never would have gone to the mountains. If he hadn't gone to the mountains, he never would have met Richard. If he hadn't met Richard, he never would have found a new purpose in life. "You know something, Richard?" he said as they neared the property. "What?" "I think everything happened the way it was supposed to. If I'd known the truth 15 years ago, I probably would have stayed the same proud, materialistic person I was back then. And now? Now I'm a better man. And I have a true friend. Something worth more than all the money I lost." 2 years after Rachel's revelation, Richard and Walter had become a well-known duo in the sustainable agricultural technology sector. Their projects had benefited over 50 rural communities in upstate New York and neighboring states. Richard had sold his remaining stake in the original company and founded a new one focused solely on solutions for family farming. Walter was now officially his partner, contributing not only technical expertise but also the life wisdom he had gained. The old cabin in the Adirondack Mountains had been expanded and transformed into a kind of research and development center where they tested new technologies in real-world conditions before implementing them in other communities. One morning, while working in the experimental garden, Richard asked a question he'd been pondering for a long time. "Walter, have you ever thought about writing a book about your experience?" "What kind of book?" "About finding peace and purpose after great loss. About starting over when everything seems lost. Walter laughed, finding the idea absurd. Who would want to read about the life of a failed ex-businessman turned farmer? You'd be surprised. A lot of people go through similar crises and feel lost. Your story could inspire others. I don't know, Richard, I'm not a writer. You don't have to be. You could tell it, and I'd help write it. It could be our next joint project. The idea stayed with Walter in the days that followed. He truly had learned so much during those years of isolation and transformation. Maybe he could help others going through similar struggles. 3 months later, they began working on the book. Walter shared his experiences, reflections, and lessons, while Richard organized everything into written form. The process was therapeutic for both, allowing them to revisit their journeys with a more mature perspective. The book was published a year later under the title Seeds of Simplicity: How I Found Peace in Isolation and Purpose in Community. To everyone's surprise, it became a bestseller, especially among people facing personal or professional crises. Walter began receiving letters from readers all over the country, sharing how his story had inspired them to rethink their own lives. Some even visited the property in the mountains, seeking advice or simply wanting to see the place where that transformation had taken place. 5 years after Richard and Walter's first meeting, they sat on the porch of the expanded cabin, watching the sunset over the mountains. The property now had a small team of researchers and volunteers, but it still held the same peaceful atmosphere that had first drawn Richard there. "Do you regret anything?" Richard asked. "Like what?" "Losing all those years alone in the mountains, not facing your problems sooner." Walter thought about the question for a few minutes, watching the chickens pecking in the yard and listening to the sound of the nearby river. "I don't regret a thing," he said finally. "Every hard experience brought me here, and here is exactly where I wanted to be." Even knowing Rachel was being blackmailed, that you could have had a different life. "Richard, if my life had been different, I wouldn't have been here when you showed up desperate. We never would have met, never would have built everything we've created together." Richard nodded, understanding the philosophy Walter had developed. Sometimes what feels like the worst moment of our lives is actually the start of something much better. Exactly. "And you know the biggest lesson I've learned over all these years?" "What?" "That happiness isn't about having a perfect life. It's about finding purpose even in the imperfections." That night, as Richard returned to his home in the city, and Walter prepared to sleep in the peace of the mountains, both reflected on how their lives had become so unexpectedly and profoundly intertwined. Richard had found in Walter's simplicity a form of success he had never considered. Walter had rediscovered in Richard's friendship that total isolation wasn't the only way to shield himself from life's disappointments. And so, the man who lived in the middle of nowhere and the millionaire who had cried out for help became not just friends, but partners in a journey of personal growth and social impact that would continue for many years. The cabin in the mountains, which once housed only the loneliness of a wounded man, was now a symbol of hope and renewal, proving that it's never too late to start over and that life's greatest blessings sometimes arrive when we least expect them. 6 months after the book's publication, Walter received a call that would once again change the course of his story. It was from Charles Morgan, director of a major publishing house in New York. "Mr. Thompson, your book is a phenomenon. We'd like to propose something bigger, a speaking tour across the country." "Speaking? I don't know how to talk in public." "You don't need to be a professional speaker. People want to hear your real story, your authentic experiences." Walter was hesitant at first, but Richard encouraged him to accept. "Think of how many people you could help, Walter. How many lives you could touch with your experience." The first talk was in Boston, in an auditorium with 200 people. Walter was nervous, but once he began telling his story, the words flowed naturally. The audience was completely engaged, and many people wept during his presentation. After the talk, a woman in her 70s approached Walter. "Thank you for sharing your story," she said, tears in her eyes. "I lost my husband 2 years ago and was thinking of isolating myself from everyone. Your talk made me realize I can find a new purpose in life." Comments like these convinced Walter to continue the speaking engagements. In the following months, he traveled to several cities, always accompanied by Richard, sharing his story of resilience and renewal. The success of the talks led to other invitations, appearances on television shows, magazine interviews, even consulting for companies looking to implement social responsibility projects. During an interview on a morning talk show, the host asked a question that deeply moved Walter. "Mr. Thompson, what would you say to someone going through what you experienced 15 years ago?" Walter thought for a moment before answering. "I'd say the pain is temporary, but the lessons are permanent, that we shouldn't be afraid to start over, because every new beginning is a chance to become a better version of ourselves." And what about isolation? Would you recommend it? Voluntary isolation can be healing for a time, but it shouldn't be permanent. We need people to grow, to learn, to find purpose. The key is finding the right people. After the interview, Walter received hundreds of messages from people who connected with his story. Many shared their own experiences of loss, betrayal, and overcoming. That was when Richard suggested creating a non-profit institute focused on helping people in personal or professional crisis. The Seeds of Simplicity Institute would be a place where people could find guidance, support, and most of all, hope. The institute opened 2 years later on a 5-acre property in the mountains near Walter's original land. It featured simple lodgings, lecture halls, therapeutic gardens, and spaces for meditation and reflection. The 3-week program combined hands-on work in the fields, counseling sessions, personal development workshops, and plenty of time for introspection. Walter and Richard had developed a unique methodology based on their own transformative experiences. The first group of participants included executives in crisis, divorced individuals, long-term unemployed, and even young people who felt lost in their careers. They all arrived carrying emotional wounds and left with a renewed perspective on life. Mary Elizabeth, a 42-year-old marketing executive who had lost her job after 20 years with the same company, was one of the first participants. "I came here feeling useless, as if my life was over," she said on the program's final day. "Now I realize it was just the end of a chapter, not the whole book." During her stay, Mary Elizabeth had discovered a passion for gardening and decided to start an eco-friendly landscaping business. 2 years later, her venture was thriving, and she had become one of the Institute's volunteer speakers. The success of the Seeds of Simplicity Institute attracted national and international attention. Journalists, researchers, and even other countries began studying the methodology Walter and Richard had developed. But for them, the true success lay in the letters and messages they received from former participants, sharing how their lives had changed for the better. 10 years after Richard and Walter's first meeting, they were preparing a special edition of their book, including stories from people who had gone through the Institute. It was a quiet afternoon in the Adirondack Mountains when an unexpected visitor arrived. Catherine, Richard's ex-wife, pulled up to the property in a modest car, a far cry from the luxury vehicles she used to drive. She looked visibly nervous and ashamed. "Can I talk to you both?" she asked hesitantly. Richard was surprised but invited her inside. Catherine seemed to have aged more than the 10 years that had passed, and there was a humility in her demeanor that hadn't been there before. "I came to apologize," she said, addressing Richard in particular. "Over the last few years, I've followed your work in the press and on social media. I've seen how you turned something bad into something good." "What happened to you, Catherine?" Richard asked, without malice. "The company went bankrupt 2 years after you left. Michael and I couldn't run it without your vision and leadership. I lost almost everything I'd gained in the settlement." "I'm sorry," Richard said, and he meant it. "But I didn't come here for money or pity. I came because I finally understood what I lost when I betrayed you. It wasn't just the money or the company. It was the chance to have someone genuinely good by my side." Catherine shared how she had fallen into deep depression after the company's collapse, how she had lost friends and felt completely adrift. It was when she read Walter's book that she began to understand certain things about herself. "I'd like to join the Institute's program," she said, surprising both Richard and Walter. "Are you sure?" Richard asked. "It'll be difficult, and I can't promise I'll be completely impartial. I understand, but I need to try. I need to find a way to forgive myself and rebuild my life honestly." Walter, who had been silently observing the conversation, finally spoke. If you truly want to change, you'll be welcome, but you have to be ready to face hard truths about yourself. Catherine joined the program 3 months later in a group that included others who had made serious mistakes in their lives. It was a painful but transformative process. During one session, she broke down in tears as she admitted she had married Richard, not for love, but for financial gain. She acknowledged that her betrayal had destroyed not only the marriage, but also her own ability to trust and be trusted. "I spent years blaming others for my choices," she said during a group session. "I blamed Richard for working too much, blamed Michael for influencing me, blamed my parents for raising me with materialistic values. Now I understand the choices were mine." By the program's end, Catherine had decided her future. She moved to a small town in the countryside where she opened a little natural goods store. She no longer had the luxurious life she once did, but for the first time, she felt at peace with herself. Catherine's transformation became one of the most talked about cases at the Institute, proving that redemption was possible, even for those who had caused great pain. 15 years after that rainy night when Richard had knocked on Walter's door, the two friends sat on the same porch where they'd had so many important conversations. The property now spanned several neighboring farms, all dedicated to the Institute and sustainable agricultural research. "Any regrets?" Richard asked, repeating the same question from years before. "None," Walter replied, smiling. "And you?" "Just one," Richard said. "What's that?" "Not meeting you sooner. I wonder how much good we could have done if we'd crossed paths when we were younger." Walter shook his head. "It wouldn't have worked. I needed to go through those experiences to become the person you met that night, and you needed to go through Catherine's betrayal to be ready for change. You're right. Sometimes life's timing is perfect, even when it feels terrible." That night, as they watched the stars twinkling in the clear sky over the Adirondack Mountains, both reflected on how two seemingly broken lives had found and rebuilt each other. Richard had learned that true success isn't measured in money, but in the positive impact we leave on others. Walter had discovered that isolation can heal, but authentic human connections are essential for a fulfilling life. Together, they had created not just a lasting friendship, but a legacy that would continue helping people for generations. The Seeds of Simplicity Institute had become a global reference for personal transformation programs, and its methods were being replicated in multiple countries. But beyond professional success, they had found something even more valuable, that it's always possible to start over, that forgiveness is freeing for both the giver and the receiver, and that life's greatest blessings often emerge from its hardest trials. The original cabin where it all began was preserved as a symbol of hope. A plaque at the entrance read, "Here began the journey of two men who discovered it's never too late to start again, and that true wealth lies in authentic human connections." And so, the man who lived in the middle of nowhere and the millionaire who had cried out for help became far more than friends. They became proof that change is possible, that redemption is real, and that sometimes life's greatest gifts arrive at our lowest point. Their names found their way into the history books of personal development, but to them the greatest achievement was simple. They had found peace, purpose, and a true friendship that would last forever. 20 years after that first meeting, Walter, now 82, and Richard, 60, still worked together at the Institute. Their stories continued inspiring people worldwide, proving it's never too late for a second chance, and that the unlikeliest encounters can lead to the deepest transformations. The end. Tell us what you thought of this touching story of new beginnings and true friendship. Have you ever been through tough times that seemed hopeless? How did you find the strength to start over? Leave a comment sharing your experience with us. Don't forget to like if the story moved you and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like this one.